In February of 2018, Mark Cuban was fined $600,000 by the NBA for saying in an interview, "Losing is our best option," implying that the Mavericks were blatantly tanking to get a top pick in that year's draft. And while $600K was just a drop in the bucket for a guy like Mark Cuban, it would still go down as one of the biggest fines in NBA history. But he wasn't wrong. That season, the Mavericks lost enough games to land the number 5 pick in the 2018 draft, which they would use to trade up in the draft to get Luka Doncic, a once-in-a-generation talent and franchise-level player, all for losing a few games in an otherwise meaningless season for the Mavericks, who were in a full-blown rebuild at that time. And while the fine was pretty hefty of a price for a simple comment admitting to tanking, Mark Cuban and the Dallas Mavericks took the meaning to a whole new level when in the 80th game of the season, with still the ability to make the postseason, they opted to throw a game to have the best chance at saving their draft pick. A season in which the Mavs made a blockbuster in-season trade for Kyrie Irving to make a playoff push, a team that has one of the best players in the NBA, and a team that just went to the Western Conference Finals last season, decided in the 80th game of the season, we're throwing in the towel despite the ability to still make the playoffs. One of the more unprecedented moves we have seen in the NBA, and just adding to the bizarre and disaster of a season for the Dallas Mavericks. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this type of content to help the channel grow, and in return I'll be putting out more NBA content like this. Now, for those who have been watching the channel for a while now, you know that I am a diehard Bulls fan, and like the Mavericks, the Bulls have had one of the more frustrating and underwhelming seasons in recent memory. Also like the Mavs, the Bulls do not have their first round pick unless it falls into the top 4 for the Bulls or the top 10 for the Mavericks. And wouldn't you know it, in the 80th game of the season, both these teams met, having the same exact record, tied for 10th best odds in the draft lottery, should either of them miss the playoffs anyway. But unlike the Mavericks, the Bulls already have their seeding locked up, finishing 10th in the Eastern Conference with no ability to move up or down whether they won or lost. And with the Bulls set to play in a win-or-go-home game next week, regardless of winning or losing their final 2 games, they decided to rest their best players in DeMar DeRozan and Zach LaVine. That being said, though, the Bulls, given it'll be a tough road to climb to make it into the playoffs as the 10th seed, would have benefited from losing their final 2 games to give them slightly better odds at retaining their pick by landing in the top 4. And given the fact they were tied with the Mavericks for the 10th worst record in the NBA, it was a chance to pick up a full game to finish in that 10th spot, which seemed easy enough considering the Mavs were actually one of those teams that were going to be fighting for their play-in lives to salvage an otherwise disaster of a season. That is, until the Dallas Mavericks decided to flip the script and rest virtually their entire roster, including only playing Luka Doncic in the first quarter, which would thus lead to one of the weirdest basketball games we have witnessed in the NBA. A game in which both teams were trying to score the least amount of points possible in an ultimate tank-off battle for the 10th worst record in the NBA. Luka, of course, did his thing to try to rack up as many stats as possible, given he knew he was only going to be playing in the first quarter. The defense on both ends was minimal. Guys were laughing and smiling throughout, very little energy, very little effort. The fans cheered, but half-heartedly, and even when Luka was brought in to start the second quarter and did an intentional foul in the first possession to be let out of the game, and what appeared to be a move to give Luka a standing ovation, the crowd instead gave some slow, confused claps as to what exactly was the purpose of him doing that. Mark Cuban, sitting courtside, was smirking at the end of the game when the Mavericks finally started doing what he had asked and losing the game and missing some critical shots that would have sent the game into overtime. The whole game was just very, very odd. And as a fan of the NBA who has been watching the league for over 2 decades, this is a bad look for the league that needs to be addressed. Now, some will probably ask, why would the Mavericks intentionally throw a game when they still have the ability to make the play-in and finish 10th in the Western Conference, especially considering their final 2 games were against the Bulls, who were going to be resting their best players, and the Spurs, who are one of the worst teams in the league. Why would they not just try to at least make the playoffs by way of the play-in, especially after all the assets they gave up in the Kyrie Irving trade, who could potentially walk in free agency? Well, the reason is, the Dallas Mavericks know that getting to the playoffs as the 10th seed, winning 2 games on the road, is incredibly hard to do, and then getting the 8th seed to likely be bounced in the first round didn't sound very practical or enticing to them. In addition to that, the Mavericks, like I mentioned at the top of the video, have traded their first round pick to the New York Knicks unless it falls into the top 10. If it falls into the top 10, they get to keep their pick. And by the Mavs finishing with the 10th worst record in the NBA, their chances of keeping their pick are exponentially higher than if they were to just finish 1 spot higher. The Mavs would have had an 8.5% chance of keeping their pick if they moved into the top 4 had they finished with the 11th worst record in the NBA, versus now finishing 10th, they now have a 79.6% chance of keeping their pick, with it most likely falling at number 10. Mark Cuban pull the unthinkable and a chance to fight for the final play-in spot, risk instilling a losing mentality and having his franchise player be okay with missing the play-in entirely to have an 80% chance of keeping their pick for this upcoming draft. Now, mind you, there is still a 20% chance that pick falls out of the top 10 if one of these teams finishing 11 through 14 gets very lucky and jumps the Mavericks in landing a top 4 pick. And here's the thing, I would not be shocked, and I am normally not one for conspiracies. I do not think the NBA draft lottery is rigged at all. The NBA has more integrity than to do something like that, I hope anyway. But I would not be shocked if Adam Silver, rather than handing Mark Cuban another massive fine, which would mean nothing to him considering his massive wealth, if somehow we see a scenario where one of those teams finishing 11 through 14 jumps into the top 4 in the draft lottery, which would effectively push the Mavs to the 11th pick, which would force them to send the pick to the New York Knicks anyway. A message from Adam Silver to Mark Cuban saying, cut the shit. You play to win the game. Because as I mentioned, this is a very bad look for the NBA. A very bad look when you have paying fans who want to see basketball played at the highest level, and for a team that actually has the ability to make the postseason. A team that went to the Western Conference Finals last year. A team that has one of the biggest faces of the league in Luka Doncic, all but to simply quit on the season to improve their draft lottery odds, to simply keep their pick. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't smart for the Mavericks to do this because it's possible they might have missed the play-in anyway had the Thunder won their final 2 games, and why not try and retain your pick if you can? But that's the problem with the draft lottery. It gets to a point where teams aren't incentivized to win basketball games, and it cheapens the level of competition. It cheapens players going out there and giving it their all, taking the game seriously, and making the game so fun to watch for us fans. And while yes, tanking has always existed, it's not like the concept of tanking is anything new, especially when a team gets to a point where they've been eliminated from playoff contention and have nothing to play for outside of trying to get the highest pick possible for a shot at a franchise player, especially in such a stacked draft class as we have coming up. But never have we seen a team in the 80th game of the season with the ability to still make the playoffs opt to throw the rest of the season to improve their lottery odds. We have legitimately never seen something like this. Not just in the NBA, but in the history of all the major sports where a team preferred to lose and wave the white flag on their season when the playoffs were still in their grasps. Not sure what the league can really do about it outside of giving more fines or rigging the draft lottery to send a message, like I said, even though I still don't think that'll happen. But the NBA and its product are at risk of things getting out of control if it gets to the point where teams are starting to prefer being lottery bound over being one of the final teams in the playoffs. That's taking tanking to a whole new level if teams are only wanting to be one of the top seeded playoff teams or bust. Either way though, the Mavericks have been eliminated from playoff contention, a train wreck of a season after going to the Western Conference Finals, and it does make you question, what does the future hold for this team going forward, especially as it relates to Luka Doncic? Let me know in the comments what you guys think. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.